Have you seen the response we've gotten to the ad that we put out
For the
about looking for a
researcher?
researcher? Yeah.
Yes, like our Facebook was going off, our email was dinging. I felt like there was a lot of interest in the position.
Yeah, and we're getting interest from like fans as well, which is awesome. Like there's a couple people that I know personally that are interested. There's some just random people from these groups, and then fans of ours that are like, "Man, I would love to be a part of this."
Because they want to hang out with me, obviously.
That's the I put that like I led with that.
Well, you should.
Bored? Need an annoying little sister? Yeah, we got the job for
Hey!
you.
Perfect.
33, 1, 0. Main event of the evening. Wednesday and half past the hour.
It's Tuesday, and you're listening to Murder Unscripted.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Murder Unscripted, a podcast that aims to immerse you in not only the true crime genre, but also the wild, wild world of true crime television. I'm your host, Ed Hydock, along with my bestie, Melissa Spivey.
Heyo.
Hey. So, as our followers know, 2 weeks ago, Melissa kicked us off in the new year by covering one of the most infamous, feared, and unfortunately fascinating monsters to ever walk this earth, Theodore Robert Bundy.
And then last week we had the best time getting to sit down with Edna Cow Martin, Ted Bundy's cousin. She was absolutely lovely, and I am obsessed with her, and I want her to adopt me.
Well, try to get her to accept your friend request before you go moving in.
Shut up.
You know who's not a good person? John Wayne Gacy, the mutant that we are going to cover today.
He is so gross. Like, did you ever notice in like every single picture he looks just greasy and sweaty, and I feel like he has KFC chicken grease leaking out of his pores? Gross. Ugh. He's so
Well,
foul.
you are not wrong about that, but you're going to find out why that insult was actually a real possibility. That KFC chicken grease comment. You have no idea how actual that is.
The Colonel.
Yeah. So he is as deplorable as they get as a human being. And with that being said, let's get right into it. John Wayne Gacy was born March 17th, 1942, and St. Patty's Day. Aren't we all just so lucky?
That is like the pile of crap at the end of the rainbow. That's
Right.
John Wayne
Honest to
Gacy.
God. John Sr. was an auto mechanic and a World War II vet, and Marion was a homemaker. And yes, John Jr. was named after the Duke, John Wayne. Can you believe that? I'd do a John Wayne impression, but I don't know if any of our listeners, they're starting to phase out. Who's going to know who that even is?
That's so true.
Well, the Gacy's were of Polish and Danish descent, and to outsiders, a good Catholic family. John Jr. was the middle child. He had an older sister, Joanne, and a younger sister, Karen. And Marion and these three children were subjected to so much abuse, physical and mental. And one of his sisters would later say that John Jr. seemed to get the most abuse. He kind of took the brunt of it from his dad. And this was for a couple reasons, mostly because John Sr. was an angry, abusive drunk, and he beat his wife merciless, sometimes for no reason at all. One time when John Jr. was a toddler, his mother was only 3 weeks postpartum from John's younger sister. The family was eating dinner, and out of nowhere, John Sr. just pushes his meal aside and gets up and hauls off and hits his wife so hard in the face that the bridge went flying out of her mouth. Mom took off, and when she tried to get away from him, he chased her down the street and began beating her in front of everybody, the whole neighborhood. So neighbors were actually able to pull him off of her, and he left for a few hours and came home and acted like nothing happened. Real class act.
He's such a monster. And just talking about this so far, doesn't it remind you of Richard Biegenwald, the thrill
Oh,
killer of
Jersey Shore. Yeah.
yes. Like with his dad being so angry for like no
Mhm.
reason. But you know
Yeah.
what? I'm sure it'll be fine because look at Richard Biegenwald. totally normal. So I'm sure there's nothing to worry about.
Oh, no lingering trauma
Oh,
whatsoever. So another reason that John Sr. seemed to direct most of his anger and abuse toward John Jr. was because John Jr. wasn't this tough, kind of masculine little boy. He was sickly. He had some sort of congenial heart condition, and this all kind of hindered his ability to play sports and be this manly young man that his dad was craving, which it really disappointed his father. And because John Jr. wasn't big enough and kind of tough like his namesake John Wayne, his father just kind of loathed him more and more. And it's like, pro tip, man, don't name your kid after such a badass like John Wayne and you won't be disappointed. It's like, I don't know, it's like my parents naming me Chris Hemsworth Hydock and then being like, oh, he's pretty doughy though. I don't know.
this kid is not Chris Hemsworth.
Well, you know what I mean? You're setting him up for
Yeah.
failure. You name him after John Wayne, who at the time was like him and Clint Eastwood, badasses, right? In Hollywood.
Yeah.
So he always told John Jr. that he was stupid or he was acting like a little girl. And he was always comparing him unfavorably, I might add, to his sisters. Oh, and if Marion would try to step in and protect John Jr. from his father, John Sr. would be like, "Oh, he's a sissy and quote probably grow up to be a queer." End quote.
Ugh.
So he's a real peach, needless to say. And while all this was going on at home, John Jr. was allegedly being molested by a contractor that his dad had brought into the house as well. So he had
He
the deck stacked against him.
he never told his parents about the contractor, right? About the guy who was like molesting him.
No, he was afraid his dad would blame him. You know, this kid was
Oh,
being molested and it was afraid his dad would say he wanted it or deserved it.
that is horrifying. And like, we can definitely give it to him. He had a shit childhood, and I totally feel bad for the little boy, but that still does not excuse his behavior later in life and the things that he did. Like, it's just not an excuse. He also had head trauma, right? Like, didn't he hit his head or something at some point?
Yeah, he was I want to say 10 or 11. So that would have been, let's see, around 1952 or 53. So he actually got hit in the head with a swing. And I don't know if it was on the playground or at home, but this led to John Jr. having some serious issues with blacking out. He would just black out. And he was in and out of the hospital for like a year and no one could really figure out what was happening. So, and get this, his piece of shit father, John Sr., this abusive man who had no medical training whatsoever, he thought John Jr. was, you know what malingering is?
No. It sounds bad.
It does, but it's like an old school term like fake, just faking it. He's malingering. You're faking an illness.
Got it.
But the second he got home from the hospital, the beatings continued. And finally, after about 5-ish years or so of being treated by doctors, John Jr.'s care team realized that he had some kind of blood clot in his brain. And that's what was causing these kind of crazy blackouts. And he took
Wow.
medication to dissolve the clot. But once he recovered, he was so far behind in his academics that he had dropped out of high school. And this wasn't entirely like out of left field because he was only a mediocre student. Teachers would actually call him, quote, unremarkable, eager to please, and lacks focus and drive. Hmm,
Oof. Can you imagine opening your report card and seeing unremarkable? Like, that would feel so shitty.
I know.
My report card used to always say, excessive talking disrupts class.
That's like still your report card, and you're 37.
That would be the nicest thing. Um, I also used to get is courteous and cooperative. So suck it, sir.
You're cooperative,
eh.
TBD. Anyway, we could sit here for hours and talk about the trauma that John Sr. inflicted on John Jr. and both his sisters and his mom too. But one of the worst things about John Sr. was his basement. He had the doors locked, they were padlocked, and he only had one key, and he was in possession of it. And the family would hear him kind of ranting and raving and talking to himself down there. And sometimes they would hear him talking in like different voices too. He was weird. And given what you're going to learn about John Wayne Gacy, the son, later in the story, this tidbit about the family in their basement is especially chilling.
That is some Norman Bates shit. And his mother, like, hell no, I'm so creeped out.
Well, buckle up. So from now on, we're going to call John Wayne Gacy, just because we're doing the John Jr., John Sr. thing. We're going to phase his dad out a little bit. And now he's just Gacy. So, when Gacy was about 18 years old, he began getting involved with the local political events and even worked as an assistant precinct captain of the Democratic Party. Which, can we just address that both Gacy and Bundy, kind of two of the most prolific serial killers ever, were both aspiring politicians? Like, isn't that a crazy coincidence?
That's so weird. And like, I don't think I talked about this too much last week or 2 weeks ago with Ted, but he was a hardcore Republican and he worked for multiple candidates and did other political things. I'm not very political, but it is crazy that these men are like so alike, but then they're so different at the same time. Like, the dichotomy that is them is just unsettling.
Dichotomy is a great word because that does really describe these guys were so different in their methodology, the way they acted, but there are so many similarities too, which we're going to get into. But pretty soon, John Wayne Gacy was mingling with VIPs and politicians and quickly learning how to appeal to people and make them feel just comfortable around him and let their guard down. Skills of manipulation that he honed and eventually used to start luring young men and boys to their death.
I'm not gonna lie, I forget with John Wayne Gacy just how charismatic and like charming he could be, which is so weird because when you look at him and you know what he did, you don't see him as like I don't see him as a smooth talking people pleaser. Like, when I look at him, I see more of like a mayonnaise filled beanbag with a mustache.
That might be your that might be your greatest insult yet. That's a pretty good one, and
It's
that
the truth though.
well, and it is weird because I mean, you have to see. We'll put some up, but some younger pictures of him to I think understand why he was so charismatic and he was a schmoozer. But when you look at older Gacy, he's fat, he's just dumpy, he's greasy, he's like that's not the guy that created this empire. It's the young one. So Gacy really enjoyed being a part of this political world, and if he thought that would win his father's approval, though, he was mistaken. So John Sr. told him that all politicians were crooks, which I never
I
thought I'd agree with John Sr.
mean,
on. Anyway, but that Gacy was being a patsy for being a Democrat.
oh
So
my
you kind of
god.
know where he lied. So at the age of 20, Gacy had enough of his father's abuse and took off for Las Vegas. And not long after he got there, he ended up in the hospital. And when it came time to pay his bill, this is crazy. He somehow turned him owing the hospital all this money into them giving him a job as an ambulance driver. And they quickly found out, though, that he was completely unqualified for that position, and they transferred him to a mortuary. And because he had nowhere to live, remember he left home, so he was kind of out on his own. He was allowed to sleep in the mortuary, and now get ready to puke.
Oof.
So Gacy Gacy has this cot in the back of the mortuary. It's like near the embalming room, and he would start having some dark thoughts when he was there alone by himself at night. And one evening, this curiosity got the better of him, and he climbs into a coffin with a deceased teenage boy.
Stop. Like, we could have just gone back to he was doing well in Vegas. Like, everything's fine.
Things were not fine, though.
Things
Things were
were
not
so
good.
not fine.
Well, as he's laying with his boy, he would hold it and caress it and rub it, this dead boy's body. And the next day, Gacy was so horrified at what he'd done. And I think it like messed with his brain, not only thinking that, but like also for doing it. Like just the thought of like, how could I let myself do that? It was like gross to him at first. So Gacy left Vegas and drove back to his parents' house. It was like a, what was that moment?
I don't know what he was thinking. Like, I fully get that everyone has like intrusive thoughts now and then, but I would
They're some of
hope
the
not
best.
that bad.
You're not supposed to let him out.
I think it's fascinating that he had that self awareness to know that something is wrong here and I need to kind of deal with it and get out of the situation.
We're going to find out that he does not get help for this thought that he had, and in fact, it kind of goes off the rails. So Gacy heads home, and I'm sure that led to a ton of ridicule from his dad. Like, I think we all saw that coming. But Gacy was determined to succeed, so he somehow, without a high school diploma or even a GED, enrolled at Northwestern Business College. He got accepted and graduated in 1963. And he got a sales job at Nunn Bush, which is a shoe company. And he quickly got promoted to manager. He was transferred to Springfield, Illinois in 1964, and this is where he would meet the woman who would become his first wife, his coworker, Mary Lynn Myers. They married in September of 64 and soon moved to Waterloo, Iowa. They would go on to have 2 children, and that's kinda all we're gonna say about them because I'm sure those kids want no association with this greasy pig.
Yeah, their names are out there, but I don't think there's any reason to discuss them.
Yeah, you can
Let
find them,
them,
but it's
let
not
them,
let them
yeah,
live in peace. Yeah.
seriously.
So Gacy married into a well-to-do family, and his father-in-law owned several KFCs in the area, and so began his greasy stretch.
Oof.
Not only did his father-in-law, hand over a few of his KFC stores to Gacy, but he would also give Gacy and Mary Lynn his house when he moved into a new one, which was kind of cool of him. I mean, he really believed in John Wayne Gacy as a businessman and a son-in-law. So at this time, Gacy was making a substantial income, and between his wife, his kids, his job, and his new hobby, which I'll get into in a minute, Gacy would later say that his life was perfect. When Gacy was in Springfield, he started volunteering in town, and his big thing was joining the Jaycees. And Melissa, do you know who the Jaycees are?
Well, the JC's in Phoenixville, like the town a couple over from us, they put on the Dogwood Festival Carnival every year, and one year they had deep fried cookie dough. I will chase that high for the rest of my life.
Have
Like,
you ever seen? We talk about the McDonald triad all the time. There's one with
yes.
food. So instead of bedwetting and like animals and stuff, it's like carbs and healthy food. That's what you need a less. I think it's time for an intervention.
My food pyramid is more like a box, and it's got
Your d
M&Ms in it.
your diet is
So,
the top triangle that says, like, "Only eat once in a while."
yeah, because I'm
That's
always
right.
on the top, number one. So I kind of knew what the JCs were, but I didn't really know what the official description was. So according to Google, the JCs, which is actually a shortened nickname of the Junior Chamber International, they're a global nonprofit organization for young professionals focused on developing leadership skills, fostering community service, and creating positive change. I didn't know or realize that they have chapters like all over the world. Like they're in like 100 different countries. And I didn't know this, but did you know that there's an actual age group? Like the members have to be between 18 and 40. So you, my geriatric friend, have aged out.
Yeah, well, they sound boring, so I don't want in.
Well, they also let John Wayne Gacy in, so I'm not feeling
Exactly.
great.
Well, they did let Gacy in, and he immediately became this highly respected and admired member of the Jaycees. So when he and Mary Lynn moved to Waterloo, Iowa, he transferred to the Jaycees there and continued to shine. Many of the Jaycees would say he was, quote, a boastful braggart, but one hell of a guy, end quote. And he would go above and beyond for the Jaycees and the community. He was always bringing KFC to their meetings, and people started calling him the Colonel.
He made them call him the Colonel, which is so douchey. Like, you are such a loser if you have to give yourself a nickname. He is so pathetic. He's like a douchey pile of congealed dumpster water.
I think it's called
You don't give
Jang.
yourself a nickname. I'm so embarrassed for him.
Disgusting. Well, this entire town of Waterloo, Iowa thought Gacy was just the best. And I mentioned earlier that he was a highly respected member of the Jaycees because he was especially good at recruiting new members, but not through networking and meet and greets, however, but more through throwing bangers, throwing wild parties that consisted of alcohol, drugs, hiring sex workers, and even wife swapping. That's how you get
So,
Jaycees.
like, a typical Tuesday night.
Thursdays at our house, but yeah. Well, regardless, at this time, Gacy was on top of the world, and he was beside himself when his parents came to visit. And for the first time in Gacy's life, his father, John Sr., spoke to him like he was a human being, gave him a pat on the back, and was like, "Good job." And he would say this was the only time that he had ever actually had a conversation with his father. When his father left to return home, shook Gacy's hand and actually looked him in the eyes, and he said, quote, "I was so wrong about you, son." End quote. And I assume it's because dad saw Gacy's success and finally deemed him a worthy son, because it seemed like that's what this John Sr. was all about, worthiness.
And that's all that Gacy wanted. So, like, he literally has everything. He's sitting there saying his life is perfect. He has his father's acceptance. How did we get so. Why are we talking about him right now? Like, this should have just stopped there and been fine.
Question as old as time. And who's a good person to ask is our guest next week who talked to him. And we'll get
Yeah.
into that at the end. So, outwardly, Gacy is a rock star, but he was hiding this secret world, and it would bring his perfect life crashing down. Gacy could not stop thinking about having sex with teenage boys. He would invite his KFC employees to come hang out in his basement and drink booze and watch porn. And sadly, in August of 1967, he acted on this impulse when he raped 15-year-old Donald Voorhees. And this was a big mistake for several reasons. First of all, rape of a minor. We all know how that's
Big one.
bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
But second of all, Donald was the son of one of the Jaycees. And Donald eventually told his father, and a few months later, his dad was pissed. I mean, reasonably so.
Yeah.
So he called the cops. And Gacy was arrested, but due to there being no evidence, and because Gacy was such a stand up guy and this pillar of the community, he's released. And keep in mind that Gacy had been a bit of a groupie toward the police for a bunch of years. He knew everyone on the force, and he would always bring them hot food from KFC. He was luring them with chicken. So when police get this complaint, they don't really believe him. And Gacy knows that. He knows that he had to ingratiate himself with the police.
How very Ed Kemper of him. Like to be
Yeah.
BFFs with the cops.
Yeah. But I would think that like cops would be savvy enough to know, like, why is this guy being so friendly and so
I think Gacy was that good. I
he
hate to
must
give
have
him
been.
any sort of credit, but I think he was so good at like manipulating people also.
He had to be because he definitely didn't have the looks that Bundy had. Bundy could
Oof.
charm the pants off anybody, but Gacy was like not that. He was like a different kind
Mm-mm.
of smooth. I don't know, I can't really explain it.
I feel like he was
So
like sleazy used car salesman smooth.
yeah, but it worked. Whatever he was doing, it
Yeah.
worked. So Gacy had raped Donald and kind of got away with it, and he had been assaulting other boys too. And now he's like, oh shit, if the one of them goes to the police, then it's like two against one. Now there's multiple accounts, so I'm in trouble. So Gacy's brilliant idea was to pay one of his employees to literally beat the shit out of Donald and get him to retract his statement. And it kind of scares the other boys too into kind of like staying quiet if something goes down. So of course Donald goes home and tells his parents, and it doesn't take long for it all to fall back on Gacy. And with that, this perfect life is shattered into a million pieces. Gacy is again arrested and eventually pleads guilty to sodomy. He went into this trial with so much arrogance that he literally thought he would be given a few years probation and then he could move back to Illinois scot free, wipe his hands of it. So he was stunned when on December 3rd, 1968, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And in 1969, Mary Lynn divorces Gacy, takes full custody of their children, and that's pretty much the end of that. Neither she nor the children would ever see John Wayne Gacy again.
You know what though? That was the best decision that like Marilyn could have ever made for herself and her children. I hope they changed their last names. I don't know that they did, but I think they should.
It was just like Bundy's girlfriend, Stephanie. Do you remember that when she left him? His whole world collapsed. So Gacy goes to prison at the Anamosa Penitentiary, and unsurprisingly, he's a model inmate. He's friendly, he's helpful, he works in the kitchen, and he was even promoted to head cook and set up a JC's chapter in prison. This guy was always wheeling and dealing and trying to like. It's weird because certain aspects of him, it's like he's trying to better his community. So I don't really know what to make of him, but because he's so easily able to portray this kind of smooth talking good guy, he's released after only 18 months of that 10-year prison sentence. And on June 18th, 1970, Gacy was a free man.
That is so frustrating. And you know what? If they had left him in prison for 10 years like they should have, none of these 33 boys and young men would have died. Like so whoever made that call to let him out, parole board, whatever, you suck and you have the blood of 33 people on your hands now. Like you can't let people like that out.
So after prison, Gacy does move back to Illinois to his childhood home with his mother. His dad had passed away at this point, which to me sounds like no big loss, but to John, it was a huge problem. Maybe because his last interaction, the way I see it, his last interaction with dad was so positive, and maybe Gacy was hoping to like build off that. Maybe we can have a relationship now. And what made it even worse is that he was in prison at the time, so the warden wouldn't let him out to go to the funeral. And this is when he started his contracting business, PDM Contractors.
Do you know what that stands for? PDM contractors.
I could guess, but it won't be PG.
Painting, decorating, and maintenance. Who in their
Mm.
right mind would let this ass clown decorate their home? Helen Keller is over here being like, oh, hell no, he has no style.
I love that. I love that you called him an ass clown because you're about to see why in just a couple minutes here. Why one of Gacy's okay, one of Gacy's alter egos, Pogo the clown. So he was indeed an ass clown. He
Wait, do you
wanted
know what
to.
POGO stands for? Do you
I
know what
don't.
POGO stands for? Really?
No, I don't.
Polish? Because he's Polish, so that's where he got Po. And then
Yeah.
go is because he was always on the go. He was so busy. So
Oh
he got
God,
Pogo.
how lame.
Yep.
He had another clown, Patches.
So
I
lame.
did know that. You know, he had
Yes.
like a nice clown and a. But we'll get into all this. So Gacy wanted to reinvent himself and forget about those pesky sodomy charges, and
Oh,
he begins trying to find that high he felt when his life was perfect, when he had a wife, two kids, a couple KFCs, sex parties, JCs, all that.
the American dream, really.
I mean, who can blame him? So Gacy is often referred to as the killer clown, and this is probably one of the most infamous aspects of Gacy. I know when I think of a killer clown, John Wayne Gacy is the killer clown. But he would dress up.
Yeah.
He would dress up like Pogo, and he would perform at children's parties and parades. The entire community thought he was amazing. People loved Pogo.
Have you heard the whole thing about his makeup? Like, most clowns have a painted white face like he did, but when they draw on the smile or the spots around their eyes, all the shapes on their face are rounded, which is like softer and appeals better to children. It looks nicer, whatever. But look at scary ass Pogo. Everything is so sharp. He's got sharp
With a
triangles for
triangle.
his eyes. Uh huh.
Hmm.
And even his mouth is not like a rounded smile. It almost is like some jacked up bat signal, but it's got like super sharp edges.
Well, it's crazy to me because Pogo was apparently like the good clown, and Patches was the one that was like I would expect to see that kind of makeup on Patches if he really had alter egos for these clowns that he was portraying. But regardless, Gacy is trying to climb this social ladder in the community, but he just can't help himself. And in February of 1971, a teenage boy alerts the Chicago PD that Gacy had picked him up at a bus stop and tried to force him to have sex with him. And somehow the parole board in Iowa is never notified of this. And when the teenager doesn't show up for court, guess what? Charges are dropped. So in August of 1971, Gacy would move into the House of Horrors, the one we all know,
Mm.
8213 West Somerdale Avenue, which was part of Norwood Park Township in a Chicago suburb. And this was the home where John Wayne Gacy would inflict excruciating torture on countless victims. This is where he would murder 33 young men and boys. And this is the home where he hid 29 of those victims in a dark and dirty, disgusting crawl space under that house. Melissa and I both feel strongly about making sure all victims get. So if our episodes run a little longer, it's so that we can talk at least a mention of every one of these victims. So 16-year-old Timothy McCoy was Gacy's first known murder victim. On January 3rd, 1972, Gacy was driving around and saw Timothy at a Greyhound bus station. The teenager had been away for the holidays and was returning to his father's home in Nebraska. He missed the bus, though, and the next one wasn't due to arrive until the following day. So Gacy drove up to the boy and offered him a place to stay for the night so they wouldn't have to sleep on a kind of a cold bus station bench. So after much convincing, he
Manipulating.
manipulating, Timothy agreed, and everything we know from here on out is Gacy's version of the events. So the two drove around for a while and then went back to Gacy's house. They had some sandwiches, they did shots of booze, and then Gacy would claim that Timothy performed consensual oral sex on him. So that's Gacy's story. I highly doubt any
Uh,
of it. So they ended the night by going to sleep in separate rooms. The next morning, Gacy woke up. Timothy was standing in his doorway with a knife, and without any context, Gacy just lunges at the kid, grabbing the knife and proceeding to repeatedly stab this 16-year-old boy, Timothy McCoy, in the chest. And I don't believe a single word of it personally,
mm-mm.
but that's the story. And Gacy would later tell investigators that he had an orgasm while killing this boy. So he then walked into the kitchen and realized that the table was set for two, and there were eggs. There were eggs cooking on the stove and bacon on the counter. So I don't know what to make of this story.
Yeah, do you believe any of that? Like, I personally think that he raped Timothy, and I think he was afraid to get caught again, and I think he snapped and killed him.
I don't know if he even snapped, you know? I think that was kind of his plan all along. Like he knew he'd
Mm-hmm.
gotten in trouble once, almost twice. So this was the only way he
Mm-hmm.
could kind of live out this dark fantasies was like be prepared to kill if I have to. That's my take on it.
Yeah.
But Gacy put Timothy's body in this crawl space, and unfortunately, he wouldn't be identified until May of 1986. And as of
Wow.
this recording, January 2025, there are still five unknown victims of John Wayne Gacy's.
The thought of someone's child being buried without a name, that, like, your name's your identity. I hate that so much. It's so
I
sad.
know. Do you ever go to the cemeteries that house old soldiers, like from the war, where they just don't know there's all these unmarked graves, and it's sad. It's sad
It's
to think
so
that that's
sad.
you have nowhere to grieve, nowhere to go visit. So while he was raping and murdering Timothy, Gacy was in the process of courting a woman, Carol Huff. And Gacy and Carol had been friends in high school and even went on a couple dates, but they lost touch. And then toward the end of 1971, beginning of 72, they decided to kind of rekindle their friendship and see where things went. And they got married in July of 72. So Carol had two young daughters, and the three of them moved into the house on West Somerdale Avenue. And Carol would immediately begin complaining about the foul odor that was coming from the house. Like she noticed it immediately. And she would spend the next 4 years ignoring this
Mm.
putrid stench of just decomposing bodies that were hid under her floors. Carol wasn't the only one who was complaining about that stench, though, and it just always lingered at the house on Somerdale Ave. And John and Carol were known for their humongous backyard barbecues and parties. They were like block parties. They'd have costumes, they'd have themes. Pogo the Clown would show up. But even at these parties, the guests would be like, "What is that disgusting smell?" And Gacy would just kind of shake his head, and it's that damn moisture in the basement. Can't beat it. But over the years, John Gacy would put down quicklime. It's like it's a white powdery substance. It's used to absorb moisture and smell in concrete.
Hmm.
I used to use it. I was 14, 15 working on a farm and
Mm-hmm.
it's cow manure. You would spill it, you would slop it, it would be everywhere and you'd walk around and put down lime. So like it's effective, but not to the extent that it hid any major smells. Like I was abundantly aware that I worked at a dairy farm when I got home. So
Could you imagine being one of those neighbors? Like, I grew up in a house that was built in the 1700s, so like a dead mouse in the walls now and then was just kind of standard. And
yeah, and
just a
even they
teeny
stink.
tiny, yeah, and it was a teeny tiny mouse stunk for like a couple of days. Like, let a little full ass person? That's gotta reek.
Well, and it wasn't just, as you know, just one
Yeah.
full ass person. It was many.
Ugh.
At this point, it's like 1974, and while Gacy's contracting business, PDM, is doing well, the marriage is not. So let's talk about Carol now. So she began noticing that Gacy only ever hired young teenage boys for his construction business, and he would often bring them into the home, take them down to the basement to like hang out.
Ugh.
And Carol was also concerned and kind of confused about things that she was finding in the house. She would find wallets, a bracelet, a class ring, like little things that shouldn't have been just laying around her house. But she also kept finding, although they weren't really hidden, male porn magazines all over the house. He was kind of trying to drop subtle hints that without just coming out and discussing his fantasies. So by 1975, the couple's marriage was pretty much over. And on Mother's Day 1975, Gacy and Carol had sex for the last time. What a great Mother's Day gift, right? Because afterward, and I know it's the last time because afterward, Gacy announced that this would be the last time we're having sex, Carol. I'm sorry. He now prefers boys to women.
The fact that she brought her two young children in a home with this man after she knew he
Hmm.
went to jail for raping a young boy.
Yep.
The fuck is wrong with you, Carol? That is no mother of the year. And you know what? Like, you know your husband only likes boys. Your house smells to high heaven. Like, what the hell do you think's going on?
Use your
I
brain. I know. I
I don't like her.
I don't know if he had some kind of spell on her, but she definitely ignored a lot of blatant signs from day one.
Yeah. I just hate that she put her children in such a dangerous situation.
I agree. Well, despite these divorce papers, the couple mutually agreed that Carol and the kids would still live in the house. And they did until the couple's divorce was final in March of 1976. And this is pretty much the point where Gacy loses all control. And before we get into his next victim, I want to talk about his methods of incapacitating his victims. So Gacy would pick up his target and he would kind of ply them with alcohol, and then he would put porn on, and he would ask the victim if he wanted to see a magic trick. And I'm pretty sure that's your isn't that your typical come online?
Don't be giving
You-
away my secrets.
Those are your moves.
That's
Wait a minute.
it's one of my lines. That's one of my lines. The other one is, "Are you from Nashville? Because you're the only 10 I see."
Oh, Jesus. Well, what he would do, he would get these kids trashed. And if they would still be sober enough to kind of rebuff his advances, Gacy would say, I was just testing your morals. I just wanted to see if you'd actually do it. But if they took the bait, Gacy would proceed with these magic tricks. And he started with his infamous handcuff trick. He would put handcuffs on himself and then pretend to like struggle for a second, but ultimately get himself out. And then he would ask the victims if they wanted to try it. And then once the handcuffs were on, he would watch the victim struggle and he would be like, "You want to know the trick?" And even when the victim said yes, he'd be like, "You have to have the keys." Like, dude.
Oh, I just imagine like the victim probably did like an initial like, "Oh, haha, you need the keys," but then just think about the panic and fear that they must have felt when the realization just hit them that they were essentially helpless. Whew, it like makes
Mhm.
me feel sick. Like oof.
He also had the rope trick, which he
Mm.
would do to his victims, where he would basically twist a rope around their neck and just strangle them. He would somehow convince them to get a loop around their neck and then just. So Gacy's next victim was 18-year-old John Butkovich. And John had worked for Gacy at PDM about 8 months prior, and he'd still not been given his last paycheck. So on July 31st, 1975, he goes to Gacy's home on Somerdale Ave to confront him. And this guy would not be seen again until December 21st, 1978, when his remains were found under the floor in Gacy's garage. And this kid, John, would have to be identified through dental records.
Wow.
And during this time, police were beginning to get this kind of weird feeling about Gacy. And by late 1975 into 76, the police had received reports about the seemingly revolving door of young men that would go in and out of his house. And especially when some of these boys started disappearing. And police were side eyeing Gacy pretty hard, but they didn't find anything to link Gacy to these disappearances. So again, it's just like super suspicious. 19-year-old Darrell Sampson would be the next young man to disappear, and he was last seen on April 6th, 1976. And this is super sad because Darrell left behind his twin brother.
I can't imagine how it must be to lose a sibling, but then to lose your twin. Like, how would you deal with that? And this Daryl kid, like, all
Yeah.
these young men were adorable, but this Daryl Sampson was so damn cute. He had like the Justin Bieber hair before Justin Bieber was a thing, and or like the Zac Efron like the swoop hair.
Someone
You
needs
know what
to
I'm talking
spray you with a hose. Seriously,
about. Oh, that's
you're out
Zac
of
Efron.
control. Well, in May of 1976, Gacy abducted and killed two boys back to back. 14-year-old Samuel Stapleton was last seen leaving his sister's house on May 13th, 1976, and his body was ID'd in November of 1979 through x-rays. Then, on May 14th, so literally the next day, 15-year-old Randall Reffitt went missing, and he was identified in April of 1979, also with x-rays. So in June of 1976, Gacy was able to abduct and murder at least two young men, 17-year-old Michael Bonin and 16-year-old Billy Carroll. Police would find Michael Bonin's fishing license in Bundy's house because we all know, any fan of true crime knows Gacy used to keep trophies.
Oh,
So sadly, there are still three unidentified victims that are thought to have been abducted and killed by Gacy sometime during this time frame of June to October 1976.
wow. That's wild. Like, there's just so many, and we just don't know them.
August was another month that had two victims. We had 16-year-old Jimmy Hackinson, who was last seen on August 5th, 1976, but he was not positively identified until 2017. Can you believe
Oh,
that?
that's
He was visiting
awful.
Chicago from Minnesota, and his last phone call was to his mom. And the day after Jimmy disappeared, so on August 6th, The second confirmed victim that month, 17-year-old Rick Johnston, went missing. So it seemed like Gacy is in some sort of like frenzy. And
Yeah.
this is a bit graphic, but Rick's body was found stacked between two other bodies, which remain unidentified to this day.
Wow. And at this point, we have what? How many confirmed victims? We're at like 9 and then 3 unidentified. Like,
Right.
that's insane. Like, what? Like, there's no cooling off period or barely any. It's just
N-
boy after boy. And I mean, what the hell was he doing, like, with his life during this time? Like, other than this?
It was definitely very risky, especially when he was getting the feeling that cops were onto him a little bit. So I'm
Mm
surprised he
hmm.
didn't just lay low. But outwardly, he was still John Wayne Gacy being John Wayne Gacy. He was running this successful contracting business. He's volunteering left and right, pogos making appearances all over town. And he's in the parades. He's visiting sick children wearing this costume. And secretly, he is still abducting, raping, torturing, and mercilessly killing his victims. And we already talked about the handcuff trick and the rope trick, but Gacy also had created his own torture device called the rack. And this was a wooden board that kind of hung from chains on the ceiling. It reminds me of those things at medieval times. You just put your head in, take a picture, and
Yes.
then you can get out. So it basically had a hole for the victim's head and hands, and he had complete control.
Ugh, that's horrifying.
I know. But again, he's finding a way, and because he's a clown and because he's got tricks, he can
Mm
fool
hmm.
these kids into thinking it's part of something innocuous. But they had no
Yeah.
idea. So now we're in October of 1976, and between the 25th and 26th, we believe Gacy killed three more young men: 14-year-old Michael Marino and his friend 16-year-old Kenneth Parker, who went missing on October 25th. And the next day was the last time that 19-year-old William Bundy was seen alive. Michael and Kenneth were buried together in the crawl space under the house, and William was also in the crawl space, but he wasn't identified till 2011, which is nuts.
Oh.
So, and for time's sake, I'm not going to go into the whole side of the story, but basically, the mother of Michael Marino doesn't believe that the body that was found was Michael's.
Mm
Her name
hmm.
is Sherry Marino, and Google's a powerful tool if you want to check out that kind of sub story on your own. So, Gacy's next victim was Francis Wayne Alexander, who was either 21 or 22 when he was killed. And to this day, police aren't sure when he was killed, other than sometime between November of 76 and March of 77. Francis was going through a divorce, and when his family couldn't get a hold of him, they figured he wanted to be left alone. And so no one filed a missing persons report, and Francis wouldn't be identified, get this, until October of 2021, 4 years ago.
That's so crazy. It
Like,
took 44 years for this poor kid to get his name back.
the fact that we're hearing about Gacy victims, like Gacy's such a historical story at this point. It happened so long
Mm-hmm.
ago. You archive him, but to think that the victims are still popping up in this, like, not that long ago, is bananas.
And the sad part is, I feel like we're never going to be able to move on from him. Well, we still have 5 unidentified victims.
Hmm.
And I do know that a lot of people were afraid to come forward to say it may be their relative, because they didn't want to get backlash if their loved one was a homosexual. But most of the kids weren't. They were
Right,
abducted.
right. So as far as we know, Gacy would only take one more life in 1976, and this was 17-year-old Gregory Godzik. And he was last seen on the 12th of December 1976, and his body would later be found in the crawl space. And Gregory's wallet was also one of the random things found around Gacy's house. So now we're in 1977, and unfortunately, Gacy's New Year's resolution was not be a better person, be less greasy, be less disgusting.
And clearly, it wasn't about hitting the gym. I'm gonna fat shame that chubby blob of Crisco any chance I get.
You're the master. So what's crazy about this is we still have 2 entire years before Gacy gets caught. So, like, there's 2 more years that we still have to get into when he was running amok in the Chicago suburbs. 19-year-old John Cizik is a part-time employee of PDM, and he was the next boy to go missing. His body would later be found in that same crawl space, and his class ring with his initials was found amongst Gacy's possessions. So on March 15th, 1977, yet another young man would disappear, 20-year-old John Prestage. and his body would also be found in the crawl space. That's a common theme, so you're going to hear that a lot.
Mhm.
So, according to reports, there's still one more victim who was believed to have been killed in 1977, and he's still unidentified. So, authorities believe he's about 17 to 20 years old, and he went missing in the spring or the fall of that year. And authorities note that at some point in his life, he had broken his clavicle, and maybe they can use that to help identify the boy
Mhm.
that's in that crawl space or was. So, let's take a break from our deceased for a little bit and talk about one of the men who survived John Wayne Gacy. So on March 21st, 1977, 26-year-old Jeffrey Rignall was walking to a bar when he had an unfortunate encounter with this guy. And Gacy convinced Jeffrey to get in his car, and as soon as Jeffrey did, Gacy covered his mouth with a chloroform soaked rag. And everything went dark, and the next thing Jeffrey remembers is waking up and realizing he was in Gacy's torture rack. Over the next several hours, Gacy would brutally rape and sodomize Jeffrey, not only with himself, but also with various objects. He was whipped, he was tortured, and at some point, Jeffrey believed there was a second person with Gacy. And the next thing Jeffrey remembered, he was waking up in the snow in a park at the base of a statue. And he would end up spending 6 days in the hospital. And of course, when Jeffrey went to police, they really didn't take his complaint very seriously. So this determined young man went out and found Gacy's home. And Gacy was arrested for this, but he was let go because said it was a consensual rough hookup, and Jeffrey was a little older, so that kind of fell into that weird gray area where he asked for it.
What do you think about this second person theory? Because, I mean, we can't believe a word out of Gacy's mouth, but he would later go on to say he has accomplices.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe that he did all this by himself.
Hmm.
Given how out of shape he was too, and given this heart condition, like this is not easy. Like I move
Yeah.
Christmas decorations downstairs and I'm winded. Like moving bodies and moving we may never know, but I do find it hard to believe that he acted alone. Gacy would go on to abduct and murder at least 7 more boys before the end of 1977. 19-year-old Matthew Bowman went missing on July 5th. His body would later be found in the crawl space. He'd been strangled and the rope was still around his neck. The next victim to disappear was on September 15th, and this is crazy, but it was 18-year-old Robert Gilroy, who was the son of a Chicago PD sergeant.
How did that not get him caught? Like, that's insane.
I know. I wish I knew. So on September 25th, Gacy would abduct and murder 19-year-old John Mowry. John was a U.S. Marine and he was attending school to become an accountant. And he encountered Gacy because he applied for a job at the PDM construction. I think that chloroform came in handy because if this kid was a Marine, 19-year-old Marine, I'm guessing is fairly strapping and strong. So he had to incapacitate him somehow.
Oh, I'm sure.
October 17th, 1977, Gacy would murder another college student, 22-year-old Russell Nelson, who was in Chicago to visit friends. And he was enrolled at the University of Minnesota studying architecture.
Gacy's so out of control. And feel free to disagree with me, Ed, listeners, whatever, but I honestly feel like Gacy is the worst of the worst. Like, I knew his story before we covered him, but I ended up reading 2 books for this episode. And my God, he was like, there were things that I didn't know. And I was just so blown away and horrified. He was just deranged.
Yeah, if he's not the absolute worst, he's up there.
Definitely.
So, November of 1977 would result in 2 more Gacy victims, 16-year-old Robert Winch and 20-year-old Tommy Bowling. And adding insult to injury, Tommy was a proud father. We had 1 kid. And our
Aw.
final murder was in 1977 was 19-year-old David Talsma, who, just like John Mowry, was a U.S. Marine. So Gacy was taking down Marines.
So these young men are fighting for the shitbag's rights and freedoms, and he's killing them?
Yeah, the irony is pretty thick.
Oh, I hate him.
So on New Year's Eve, 1977, Gacy picks up 19-year-old Robert Donnelly from a bus stop. This is something he'd done before. That was a tried and true technique. And shockingly, Gacy would let Robert live, but not before torturing this young man so severely that Robert actually begged Gacy to kill him. It got that bad.
Aw.
Gacy brutally raped Robert and then would hold his head underwater until he passed out and then revive him and do it again. And before Gacy released Robert, he told him, "Don't bother going to the police because no one's going to believe you." And you know what? Given his track record, he wasn't wrong. So here we are finally in 1978, and that's the year that everything would come crashing down on Gacy. So on February 16th, 19-year-old William Kindred would go missing, and he was the last body that Gacy was able to kind of fit in his crawl space.
Oh, I can't even fathom being in that crawl space or even in that house. It just had to have stunk.
I don't know if there's a smell that could be worse. I mean, the amount of bodies he has piled up in his basement and is doing nothing with. A little lime is not going to cover up this putrid smell.
And I
So,
imagine his clothing had to have smelled like it. Like, he would, if you smoke in your house, you're going to smell like smoke,
yeah,
even if your clothes are clean. So I
right.
feel like he had to have just stunk. Like, it had to have just been on him permanently.
Yeah, it must have. It must have.
Oof.
Well, he would continue to pour acid and lime on these bodies to cover up the smell, but that doesn't help. And it got to the point where neighbors were like, "All right, dude, this is not moisture. This is not even like a broken sewer pipe or a septic backup. Like, we don't know what this is, but holy shit, you got to do something about it." Like that the community was saying, "Figure this out." So now Gacy needs another place to hide victims. Like he's not done killing, but now he's drawing so much attention that he needs to find another spot. So in June of 1978, Gacy would murder 20-year-old Timothy O'Rourke and dump his body in the Des Plaines River. So before we go any further, I just want to point out that it was 1978 that a very infamous picture was taken of Gacy and Rosalind Carter, Jimmy Carter's wife. She was the first lady of the U.S. at that point.
This is my favorite thing ever.
Well, long story short, John had put together this entire Polish Day celebration, and Rosalind was scheduled to make an appearance. So she and Gacy took this picture together, and in the picture, you can see Gacy has a pin on his lapel, and the pin means he had clearance from Secret Service. Isn't that insane?
I love that. And apparently afterwards, like after everything came out, this like everyone was like, "What the hell?" to the Secret Service, and they were
Yeah,
like,
way to go.
"Oh no, he totally snuck in. Like it's not our fault. What the hell?" But like
Yeah,
finally, they had to be like, "All right, well here's what happened. You see, we forgot to check his background before he lived where he lives now. So, oops."
kind of like missing a guy climbing onto a roof, but who am I? So in November of 1978, Gacy would abduct and kill two more young men, 19-year-old Frank Landigan and 20-year-old James Mazzara. And one of Gacy's signature moves was to shove the victim's underwear as far down their throat as he possibly could. And that's exactly what he did to Frank. Both of those guys, the last two I mentioned, were actually found in the Des Plaines River. So let's talk about the crime that would finally take Gacy down. Finally. So on December 11th, 1978, 16-year-old Robert Peist was at his job at a local pharmacy, and he was finishing his shift, and his mom Elizabeth was in the car in the parking lot kind of waiting to drive him home because he didn't have a car yet. He was trying to desperately save up, so working as many hours as he could at this pharmacy. So mom's waiting in the car, and Robert runs outside, and he's like, "Hey, this guy wants to talk to me. He's got a job offer at this awesome construction company. Like, I'll just be a few minutes." And his mom was like, "All right, no problem." So she could tell how excited Robert was, especially because he was supposed to make, at least what Gacy told him, $5 an hour, which in 2025 money, that's like $26 an hour. So not too bad.
Damn. Yeah, for like a 16-year-old, that's amazing.
I know, right? And this was on his mom's birthday. So I think she was turning 46 and she was going to pick him up and then the family was going to have dinner and sing happy birthday, eat cake, yada, yada. But Mrs. Peist waits and waits and waits. And finally she goes inside to see what's going on and Robert is gone. He's nowhere to be found. And luckily, the pharmacist was able to tell Miss Peist who Robert had been talking to about this job. And he knew him from around town, Mr. John Wayne Gacy. So mom goes to the police that night and she tells them about Robert going missing and that Gacy was the last person he was seen with. So the next morning, police pay Gacy a visit and he is not happy to see them. They ask him about Robert and Gacy says, "Yeah, he'd been at the store, but I never talked to the kid, you know?" And they ask Gacy to come down to the station, and he tells them he's waiting for a very important phone call from his mom regarding the death of a family member. So you're going to need to that takes precedence. And police are like, "All right, well, what about this missing kid? We really need you to like handle your phone call and come down to the station." And John Wayne Gacy had the audacity to tell investigators that they had no respect for the dead.
Okay, let's talk about this. There was literally a victim buried under his front door area. And you want to talk about disrespecting the dead when you're standing on one of your victims telling the cops that they're not being respectful of the dead? What is wrong with this picture?
He's in the middle of a big ruse. That's just so he didn't mean any of it, you know? So the
God.
cops are like, all right, well, you better come down to the station later today then. So that night, Gacy calls the police station and he's like, do you really still need me to come by? Like, you sure about this? And they're like, yes, there was this missing boy and it's super important that we talk to you. And they ask him how long till he can get there. And Gacy tells him he'll be right down. Don't worry. And keep in mind, it's late now, so it's like 10 p.m. And finally, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Gacy rolls into the police station, just completely disheveled, covered in mud, and just detectives are gone because it's 3 o'clock in the morning. So the officer on duty is like, come back tomorrow. He was probably feverishly trying to cover things up in his basement. You are
Oh, yeah.
boxed in, bro. Not only does your house smell, but
Mm hmm.
you are up against a wall at this point. So police are thinking that Gacy's holding Robert in his home, so they get a search warrant for this house on Summerdale Ave. And they begin searching, and on December 13th, they find some incriminating evidence, including a receipt from the pharmacy. One of Robert's coworkers at the pharmacy borrowed Robert's jacket while they were working, and the girl processed an order for herself and put the receipt in the pocket of the jacket. So police knew that Robert had to have been at the house. Otherwise, how would that receipt have gotten there?
Mm
And
hmm.
they find so much more than just a receipt. And some of the items that are found, I can just list them here. They find police badges. They find a hypodermic needle and syringes, the rack, the torture chamber, right? Although they didn't really know what it was at the time. It was just this weird structure in the basement. Books and magazines such as 21 Abnormal Sex Cases, Tight Teenagers, and Pederasty, Sex Between Men and Boys. Hmm.
Foul. Absolutely foul. But don't forget about the one entitled The Great Swallow.
Oh,
I don't think it's about birds, but I'm not
can guarantee it's
positive.
not about birth. Oh, they also find an 18-inch dildo covered in,
Oof.
we'll call it bodily fluids and various
Oof.
substances. They find drugs, including Valium. They find a ton of clothes that were definitely too small for Gacy, but perfectly sized for a young boy, and among other incriminating evidence. So at this point, they set up 24-hour surveillance on Gacy. They do not let him out of their sight, and Gacy starts playing these games with them. He would get in his car and just drive around aimlessly for hours. And if he was at a bar or restaurant, the police would sit there as well and just watching him. He would send beers over to him, and he would even go talk to him. And at one point, he even like joked about his business. He joked about like his ex-wives and him being a clown. And he's like, clowns can get away with murder. Wink. It's like,
Oh, what a cocky little
oh
bitch.
my God, he's so cocky.
God. So
So
cocky.
one cold morning, Gacy went out to the detectives who were watching his house and invited them in for breakfast. And these detectives are like, okay. I mean, to be fair, who can turn down bacon and eggs? But
From
holy
John
shit.
Wayne Gacy, I can.
But like, if you're there to surveil the guy, you don't accept a breakfast invitation.
I think he had been asking so much that they were finally like, you know what? If this guy wants to let us in without a search warrant, like, shit, we're gonna just go in. So good for them.
Yeah, well, while one of them's inside talking to Gacy, one of the detectives has to use the bathroom and the heat kicks on. And all of a sudden, this detective is basically assaulted with the stench of just decomposition wafting through the heater vents.
Barf, barf, barf.
So the police do leave and continue their surveillance. And at this point, Gacy is pretty much starting to unravel. He's drinking heavily, and the stress and the weight of everything is just pounding on him. And on December 20th, he drives to his lawyer's office with the surveillance team behind him, and he drunkenly confesses to everything, to the lawyer, mind you. And the lawyer's like, be right back. Gotta, he just disappears in the hedges like Homer Simpson.
You gotta
And
get a
he,
drink.
yeah. So he runs down and he calls the police and he's like, I can't tell you what he said, attorney client privilege, but don't let Gacy leave. And of course, he can't really tell them anything. So they let him leave and they follow him back to the house. Then on the next day, December 21st, they're following Gacy and he sells weed to some teenager right in front of them. Like, what is he doing? And they decide to kind of let it happen and just follow him for a bit until they finally pull him over and arrest him for selling marijuana.
Do you feel like he wanted to get caught at this point? Like, you know, you're being followed. You know, weed is like super duper illegal in the 70s.
Hmm.
Like, why would you do that? Do you feel like he wanted to get caught?
I do. I absolutely do. And
Yeah.
and I think that he was just so desperate and he was really feeling the heat and
Mhm.
he was like, I have no way out of this, you know.
Yeah.
But it's weird though, given his later actions. So at this point, police get another search warrant, and this is when all hell breaks loose and the world will never be the same. This is when Gacy became a phenom. So in the late hours of Friday, December 22nd, 1978, investigators would begin excavating Gacy's crawl space of horrors. This would go on for several days, even into the new year, 1979, and it's winter in Chicago, so there were many days when the temperature would be single digits and even in the negatives due to the wind chill. And neighbors would report seeing police and forensics techs wearing full hazmat suits, and they would come running outside, rip their head covering off, and just start vomiting or like violently retching on the front lawn. So even in the dead of winter, this house.
That would be me. Like, I can't handle smells. I get nauseous super easily. I would be so sick in that house. But
Hmm.
I also remember reading about the neighbors just saying, like, it was just body after body after body coming out of this house. And each
It
time
never
they thought
ended.
that, yeah, each time they thought they were done, another body bag would come out. Like, I was flipping through old newspapers and just to see each day, like, two more bodies recovered, three more bodies. Like, I cannot even fathom what it was like to be alive and in that area at that time.
Well, the majority of the victims were kind of too decomposed to identify. I mean, they were stacked on top of each other to the point where their bodies started to morph together. I don't even know how to describe it. It kind of became
They almost
an amorphous,
melted.
yeah, like
Yeah.
into each other.
Hmm.
So investigators bring in this team of forensic odontologists to compare the teeth of the victims to records they had from all these missing reports. And while all of this is happening, Gacy was in police custody. He would confess to police, but he would change his stories so many times, and he was just consistently trying to minimize his role in these murders. And then he would tell police that it wasn't him committing these murders. You see, I would black out because I have this history of doing so. And before each of the murders, somebody else would take over. Jack Hanley, and this is who Gacy would refer to as Bad Jack. And Bad Jack was the one, the person inside him who was committing all these murders because he hated homosexuals.
Okay, this is like when you knock your mom's vase over and you blame your invisible friend. Like,
Yeah,
shut the hell up.
it's so true. And that's what I was just talking about when we talked about him wanting to get caught. Why get caught and then start making stuff up? Like, just get caught,
Exactly.
say what happened. So, John Wayne Gacy's murder trial begins on Wednesday, February 6, 1980 in Chicago with prosecutor Bob Egan ready to put Gacy behind bars. And Egan had gone to the Somerdale Ave home and kind of watched police bring out this parade of bodies. Body, body, body. And then that's when he saw the true horror that John Wayne Gacy inflicted on 33 innocent lives.
Um, Fun fact in the middle of all this murder, Bob Egan, the prosecutor, he was also the prosecutor of the bus driver. Do you remember when the Dave Matthews Band tour bus, like their sewage tank emptied on some bridge in
On the
Chicago and
bridge.
covered, yes, and like covered people on like a tourist boat in Dave Matthews poop? Like, remember that? Well, this prosecutor, Bob Egan, he prosecuted the bus driver. So
Unbelievable. I did not know
that's,
that.
well, Mr. Egan has seen some shit. But I'm bumped.
Womp
Get it?
womp.
Ah!
I tell the dad jokes around here, not you.
That's true.
So this trial began, and the jury was made up of 5 women and 7 men. And Bob Egan presented a truly powerful and compelling opening statement that was said to have really struck the jurors and set the tone for the whole trial. And when it was the defense's turn, the argument was basically, yeah, Gacy's like a terrible human and he did some really messed up stuff, but he's insane, so it's not his fault. and it was bad Jack and all this other stuff. And when it was time for family members of the victims to testify, this brought tears and just complete anguish to not only the speaker, but also everybody who was listening in that courtroom. I mean, can you imagine listening to a heart wrenching story from the mom of one of these kids who had melted into another kid because he was in a crawl space of a house?
Your baby's body is in a fucking crawl space. I can't.
Several members of law enforcement also testified about the horrors that they found on Summerdale Ave, as well as the doctors and psychiatrists who had looked at Gacy over the years. And these testimonies went on for several days, and ultimately the state marched over 60 people up to the witness stand. And the defense basically leaned on the testimony of Gacy's mom and sisters who were talking about the abuse that Gacy was subjected to at the hands of John Gacy Sr. And they paraded a string of medical experts who said the opposite of the state's witnesses, that they believed Gacy was possibly schizophrenic and exhibited all this antisocial behavior.
Yeah, me too, John. It doesn't make you special,
Yeah, we
idiot.
all we all have it, John.
We're all antisocial, bro. Jesus.
But they made an interesting choice with our first witness. So they brought up Jeffrey Rignall, who was the kid that he raped and almost tortured to death. And the prosecution was afraid to use Jeffrey because he had talked about the assault to a book. He went to the media with it, and the defense wanted to use him because Jeffrey said Gacy looked crazy during those attacks. So this was kind of helpful for their insanity defense. And I don't know how well it worked though, because Jeffrey was like crying. He even threw up on the witness stand. So I think it really showed what he went through.
Yeah, that poor guy. And I just imagine the jury was like, oh my God, for this grown man to be up here crying and getting actually physically ill, whatever he
Mhm,
went through had to have been bad. And then to think about that for 33 other boys.
mhm. Yep,
Wow.
nuts. Well, on March 12th, this is crazy to me. So March 12th, 1980, the jury deliberated for just 2 hours. You feel like you have all these people and bodies and things that happened, and then in a matter of 2 hours, they come back with a guilty verdict. And the next day, they all voted to put Casey to death.
I watched some interviews with him and read about some interviews with him like right before death row, and he never took responsibility for things. You know, everything was someone else's fault. But he was also very like just wanted to tell people. It's like he just wanted someone to talk to. He was constantly talking because he loved doing that.
Mhm,
Um, did you know that he in prison? Well, we had our one game at the end, our palette cleanser, and we did his paintings.
mhm.
But he did all sorts of paintings when he was in prison. Some were purchased. I think some are still out there. And did you know that he had a 1-900 number that you could call?
I did know that.
Did you? Yeah, you could call
Yeah,
this 1-900 number, and it was basically just him whining about how he was innocent.
it's just so
And people
gross.
paid money for that.
Do you know that our guest next week has 3 Gacy paintings in his possession?
No.
One was given to him, 2 he bought, another one Gacy gave to him.
Holy shit.
We will hear more. But
I did
for
not
now,
know
on May
that.
10th, 1994, the day finally came for John Wayne Gacy to be put to death for the murders of 33 young men and boys. And in true Gacy fashion, is selfish right up to the bitter end. He spent the morning complaining about being put to death. And in an article from the Chicago Trib, Gacy was quoted as saying, "Taking his life would not compensate for the loss of the others." End quote.
The others, screw this guy. They have names, you greasy ball of schmutz. Like, can we talk about though, like the people celebrating his death? They were outside, just like what they did with Ted, Burn Bundy, Burn. These people are outside. They laid out 33 body bags, like on the sidewalk in front of the jail. And I feel like seeing that could really screw you up. Like, that just
Mm-hmm.
makes it, I feel like, so much more real. Um, they also sang the Nana Nana song Kiss Him Goodbye. Like they were
Mm-hmm.
singing it so loudly that they could actually hear it in the execution ward, which
No
I think
kidding.
is amazing.
That is cool.
Oh, wait, tell us what his fat ass ate as his last meal, because you know
Oh,
it's
he
gonna be
had
disgusting.
it was deep fried shrimp, a bucket of KFC. He had French fries. He had strawberries. What else did he have? A bottle of. I think he'd washed it down with a Diet Coke. Because
Oh, well, the hey, Coke helps. Well, I also read about how up to his execution, he was super jovial, like a little chatty Cathy, like he didn't know what was coming. And we've always been told that his last words were, and I quote, kiss my ass. Have you heard that?
I have not heard that actually.
Well, I've always heard that.
Hmm.
And that's actually, he didn't, according to most sources, he didn't really have last words.
Oh, he just took his punishment and
Yep.
took the big nap.
Yep.
Well, a little after midnight on May 9th. So I guess it would be May 10th. He was given a 3-drug cocktail that put him to sleep and stopped his heart. And there was a little bit of an issue when the line clogged, but moments later, at 52 years old, John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead. And there is so much more for us to cover with that, but not in one episode. So that was the condensed version of John Gacy. There's a lot out there. I mean, the lengths to which this guy went, and you think what we told was horrific. Listen to some of the real documentaries that go on for a couple hours and really get into the nitty gritty. It's it's one of the most disturbing things you'll ever hear. And our guest next week, Dr. Jeffrey Smalden, was a we'll talk about his backstory next week about who he is, but basically a forensic psychologist who had spent hours upon hours upon hours corresponding with people like Manson, Squeaky Frome, Ted Bundy. Even he had a kind of
Mm-hmm.
a very short-lived pen pal relationship with, but he'd spent 20 hours, I believe, with John Wayne Gacy. So we're really going to get the reason we didn't go into too crazy much detail is because we want you guys to hear it from a person who worked directly with him and has some serious insight into the brain of John Wayne Gacy.
And I have one more fun fact. So he was executed on May 10th, which he was when he originally got arrested in Waterloo, Iowa for
Hmm.
the sodomy, May 10th. So it was like full circle.
At least do that. If it's
I love
close,
that.
they'll wait like another day or two just to have it time out and kind of be extra.
It's
But
wild. It's like bookends of his life, literally, like when he
yep,
started being a shitbag to the last day.
yep, 100%. And I'm really excited to hear what Smalden has to say about the psyche of Gacy.
Yeah, me too. Well, listeners, I would love to know if you agree with me in saying that he was like the worst of the worst. Or if there's anyone, I can't even think of someone. Even, I think he's worse than Carl Panzeran. And that's a
Mm,
big, big statement to make
I
because
think so
he was
too.
fucking the devil. But yeah, I just think that Gacy's even worse than him.
I think Gacy was struggling with some internal demons about his sexuality, where
Hmm.
the other case was more just plain evil. But
Yeah, that's fair. Well, listeners, we would love to know what you think. So hit us up on our socials at Murder Unscripted. You can email us murderunscriptedpod@gmail.com, or you can shoot us a line through our website www.murderunscriptedpod.com. That is all we have. Ed, thank you for covering this. I know it was not fun to research or write or read because there's a lot going on,
there it
but
is.
we appreciate you going over that. So until next week, do not be friends with anyone who gives you free KFC, first of all.
So hard though. It's so good.
Usually,
I
no.
love KFC.
Usually I could be bought with fried chicken, but I can't do KFC. Nope. Also, if anyone knows where to get deep fried cookie dough, hit me up because that would be my dream.
We got to get you on a meal plan.
Until next time, remember, perverts don't wear signs that say they're perverts.
And I thought Bundy invented the sign. I changed my mind. This guy takes it.
Gacy's sign should say, I'm a beanbag filled with mayo.
Literally the greatest description ever.
Bye!
August was another month that had 2 victims. We had 16-year-old James Jimmy Hackinson, who was last seen on August 5th, 1976. And he was not Jesus Christ, positively,
Positively.
positive 16-year-old Robert Peist was at his job at the local pharmacy, and he was finishing his shift with his mom. She worked there too.
No. No, she didn't.
Are you sure? Even like part-time, like a couple hours a week, filling Ozempic prescriptions.
I'm like, where did you see that?
In November of 1978, Gacy would abduct and kill 2 more young men, 19-year-old Frank Langdon and Langdingen. So in November of 1978, Gacy would abduct and kill 2 more young men, 19-year-old Frank Langdingen and
Landingen.
August was another month with. Oh, is she all right?
Yeah, she's fine. She's being a brat.
All these puppies just needy. Yeah, dude. Where
Yeah, you needy. You needy boo boo.
need attention? Where's that come from?
I have no idea. I also didn't know that there was an actual like age group. Like members have to be between ages 18 and 40. So
Oh, I'm sorry. I have this like lip. It's like I can feel. It's like I hit a nerve, so I can feel it,
oh,
and it's making me sneeze. Like I can just feel my lip, and I'm just going. I can feel.
that's so weird. He is so pathetic. He's like a douchey pile of congealed dumpster water.
I think it's called
You don't
Jang.
give yourself a nickname. I'm so embarrassed for him.
Dumpster juice. That stuff that's when you squeeze trash and the juice that comes out. I think that's
That's Gacy.
called Jang.
His cologne. That's what it would smell
oh.
like.
Disgusting.
Don't be giving away my secrets.
Those are your moves. Wait a minute.
It's one of my lines. That's one of my lines. The other one is, are you from Nashville? Because you're the only 10 I see.
Oh, Jesus.
Did it hurt when you fell from heaven?
Please stop. Please stop.
You're so jealous of my smooth lines.
Unsubscribe. I'm unsubscribing.